What would you do if your world turned upside down overnight? A desperate mechanic, a mysterious millionaire, and a love tangled in secrets and betrayal. As scandal erupts and rivals emerge, Layla discovers a hidden talent that could change everything, or destroy it. Where are you watching from? Layla wiped her grease-streaked hands on her already stained overalls, her movements brisk and deliberate. The clanging sounds of tools echoed through the small family auto shop, a business her father had built with his bare hands. She exhaled sharply, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. Another bill lay unopened on the counter, likely another overdue notice. The shop was on its last legs, and no matter how many hours she put in, it never seemed enough. The steady hum of an engine caught her attention, breaking her focus. Layla turned toward the entrance, squinting against the afternoon sun as a sleek black luxury car rolled into the lot. Its gleaming exterior was entirely out of place among the battered trucks and rusting sedans her shop usually serviced. The engine sputtered once before cutting out completely. For a moment, silence fell over the garage, save for the crunch of gravel beneath the car's tires. The driver's door opened and out stepped a man dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. Layla blinked, her initial impression muddled by the sharp angles of his face and the effortless grace with which he moved. He was entirely too polished for her world of grease and grime. "Excuse me," the man began, his voice smooth but firm. "Are you the mechanic?" Layla raised an eyebrow, folding her arms over her chest. "What gave it away? The coveralls or the wrench in my hand?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face, but he didn't reply. Instead, he gestured toward the car. "It stalled on the highway. I need it fixed immediately." Layla sighed. "Well, you've got two options. You wait until I finish the car I'm working on, or you take it somewhere else." The man frowned, clearly unaccustomed to such bluntness. "Time is a luxury I don't have," he said curtly. "I'll pay extra if you prioritize it." Her eyes narrowed at his tone, but before she could retort, the shop phone rang. She snatched it up, muttering a brusque greeting. As the voice on the other end began speaking, her expression shifted. Her hand tightened on the receiver, her knuckles turning white. "What do you mean they're raising the interest rate again? I barely—" Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, glancing at the man who now stood watching her. She turned away, lowering her voice. "Look, I just need more time. Please." The call ended with a click that felt final. Layla set the phone down slowly, her face pale. Without another word, she grabbed her tools and headed toward the sleek car, her jaw tight. "Pop the hood," she called out. The man raised an eyebrow but complied. He stood silently, observing as she worked. Minutes ticked by, and Layla's focus never wavered. Her hands moved deftly, unfastening bolts and adjusting components with an ease that suggested years of experience. "Not many mechanics could handle this engine," the man remarked eventually, his tone almost conversational. "Not many mechanics would want to deal with it," she shot back, not looking up. "But I've got bills to pay, so here we are." He chuckled softly, a sound that seemed almost out of place in the gritty shop. "I respect your candor." Layla paused, glancing up at him briefly. For the first time, she noticed the subtle tension in his stance, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He wasn't just a man in a fancy suit, he was carrying something heavy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "You don't look like the kind of guy who'd respect much of anything," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. The man smiled faintly but didn't respond. Instead, he extended a hand. "Zaid Karim." She hesitated, wiping her hand on her coveralls before shaking his. "Layla Brooks." "Layla," he repeated, as if testing the name. "You're very skilled," she snorted softly, returning to the engine. "Flattery doesn't pay the bills." He didn't reply, but something in his expression shifted. Layla couldn't shake the feeling that he was assessing her, not just her skills, but something deeper. She ignored the thought, focusing on the task at hand. When the car's engine finally roared to life, Zaid's eyes lit up with something like relief. "Impressive," he said, pulling a sleek black wallet from his jacket. "What do I owe you?" She shook her head, waving him off. "Just the standard rate. I don't charge extra for being good at my job." As he handed her the payment, his fingers brushed hers briefly, and she felt a strange jolt, a mix of unease and curiosity. Saeed hesitated before speaking again. Miss Brooks, I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you. Layla frowned, her instincts immediately on high alert. I'm not looking for opportunities, she said flatly. I'm just trying to keep this place afloat. This could help, he said, his tone calm but firm. I'll be in touch. With that, Saeed slid into the driver's seat and drove off, leaving Layla standing in the driveway, her mind racing. She stared after the car, her unease growing. Whatever Saeed Karim wanted, she had a feeling it wouldn't come without a price. Layla sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bills scattered in front of her. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, their contents spelling out the same inevitable conclusion. She was out of time. Her father's raspy cough echoed from the adjoining room, pulling her attention away. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. There was no denying it. She was drowning. The knock at the door was sharp and deliberate, slicing through the quiet tension of the house. Layla stood, brushing her hands down her jeans as she approached. Swinging the door open, she found herself face to face with Saeed Karim. His tailored suit seemed out of place against the peeling paint of her porch, but his expression was unreadable. Mr. Karim, she said warily, her hand tightening on the doorframe. What are you doing here? May I come in? He asked, his tone polite but firm. Layla hesitated before stepping aside, allowing him into the cramped living room. Saeed took a moment to survey the modest space, his gaze lingering on the stack of medical bills on the table. What do you want? Layla's voice was sharp, the weariness in her tone barely masked. I have a proposition, Saeed replied, turning to face her. One that could solve your financial troubles. Layla crossed her arms. I'm not interested in charity. It's not charity, he said evenly. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Her brow furrowed. What kind of arrangement? Saeed stepped closer, his presence commanding the small room. A marriage, he said, his voice steady. In name only. It will remain private, and after a set period, we'll go our separate ways. Layla blinked, momentarily stunned into silence. A marriage? Are you insane? Saeed's jaw tightened. You're not in a position to turn this down. I've done my research. Your shop is weeks away from foreclosure and your father's medical expenses are mounting. Anger flared in Layla's chest. You've been digging into my life? I needed to ensure you were the right candidate, he said unapologetically. I won't force you, Miss Brooks, but consider the alternative. This arrangement benefits us both. Layla laughed bitterly, shaking her head. And what do you get out of it? A pretty face to parade around at charity events? Saeed's expression darkened. I need stability in my public image. Investors are hesitant after recent scandals. A marriage to someone grounded and hardworking counters the perception that I'm unreliable. Layla stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on her. You think this will fix everything? A fake marriage? It's an opportunity, Saeed said firmly. For both of us. You'll have financial freedom and the means to care for your father. In return, I get the stability I need. It's a simple transaction. Layla's fists clenched at her sides. Marriage isn't a transaction, she snapped. It's supposed to mean something. And what does it mean to you right now? Saeed countered, his tone sharper than before. You're drowning, Miss Brooks. Let me throw you a lifeline. The room fell into silence, the tension between them almost tangible. Layla's mind raced, her pride and desperation warring within her. She thought of her father, his health worsening by the day. She thought of the shop, her mother's legacy crumbling under debt. She thought of the foreclosure notice, the final blow she couldn't withstand. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice quiet. Saeed nodded, stepping back toward the door. I'll give you 24 hours. After that, the offer expires. Layla followed him to the door, her thoughts spinning. As he stepped outside, Saeed turned back, his gaze meeting hers. Don't let pride rob you of a solution, he said before walking away. She closed the door behind him, leaning her forehead against the cool wood. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Pride. It was all she had left. But could it pay the bills? Could it save her father? Her eyes fell to the pile of envelopes on the table, the weight of her reality crashing down. In the end, the choice didn't feel like a choice at all. Layla stepped out of the black sedan, her eyes scanning the sprawling estate that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Zaid's mansion stood like a monolith against the afternoon sky, its stone facade imposing and cold. The weight of her decision settled heavily in her chest. This was her new life, a life she'd agreed to for reasons she couldn't quite justify to herself. The driver opened the trunk and unloaded her single, worn suitcase. She felt a pang of embarrassment as her modest belongings were dwarfed by the grandeur surrounding her. Before she could linger on the thought, Zaid appeared at the front door, his presence commanding as ever. "Welcome," he said, his voice even. His expression betrayed nothing, as though this were a business meeting and not the first day of their marriage. Layla offered a curt nod, following him into the house. The interior was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings, marble floors, chandeliers casting golden light over the space. She couldn't help but stare, her steps faltering slightly as she took it all in. "This will be your room," Zaid said, motioning to a door at the end of a long hallway. His tone was distant, as if rehearsed. "You'll find everything you need inside." Layla stepped inside, her breath catching. The room was enormous, the king-sized bed draped in fine linens that looked untouched. A small sitting area by the window offered a panoramic view of the meticulously landscaped grounds. It was all too much, too pristine, too perfect. She turned to face him. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was quiet but edged with frustration. "What's in it for you, really?" Zaid's gaze didn't waver. "We've already discussed this. You help me and I help you. It's as simple as that." "Nothing about this is simple," Layla muttered, more to herself than to him. Zaid hesitated, his jaw tightening briefly before he spoke again. "Dinner is at 7. I'll have someone bring your things." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress. The silence in the room was deafening, amplifying her doubts. She hated how small she felt here, like an intruder in a world that didn't belong to her. Hours later, as the evening crept in, Layla wandered the halls, the soft soles of her shoes muffled against the polished floors. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Her fingers brushed against the wall as she turned a corner, her eyes catching on a door that stood slightly ajar. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, before stepping closer. The room beyond was dimly lit, its air heavy with the scent of aged wood and leather. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and objects that seemed out of place in the sleek modern mansion. Her gaze landed on a small table in the center of the room, where an ornate photo frame rested. Curiosity pulled her forward, her footsteps careful. She picked up the frame, her breath hitching as she took in the image. Zaid stood beside a woman, her features striking and familiar in a way Layla couldn't explain. The woman's hand rested on Zaid's arm, their expressions warm and unguarded. This wasn't the Zaid she knew. "Miss Brooks?" A voice cut through the quiet, startling her. Layla nearly dropped the frame, spinning to find Riley, Zaid's assistant, standing in the doorway. Her sharp gaze flitted from Layla to the photo in her hand. I was just," Layla stammered, her face flushing. "Curiosity can be dangerous here," Riley said coolly, stepping into the room. She reached out and plucked the photo from Layla's hands, setting it back on the table with deliberate care. "I suggest you stick to the spaces you've been given access to." Layla opened her mouth to respond, but Riley didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and left, her movements brisk and purposeful. Layla stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. The unease she'd felt since stepping into this house only deepened. As she made her way back to her room, Layla couldn't shake the image of the woman in the photo. Who was she? And why did it feel like the house itself was guarding her secret? Layla woke to the sound of muffled voices just outside her door. The words were indistinct, but the urgency in the tones was unmistakable. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and strained to listen. Moments later, the sound of hurried footsteps faded down the hallway. Her chest tightened with unease. Something was wrong. Pushing the thought aside, she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. The dining room, where breakfast had been laid out earlier, was empty except for Riley, who was pacing with a phone pressed to her ear. The sharp click of her heels against the marble floor reverberated like a metronome, setting Layla's nerves further on edge. I don't care how it got out, Riley hissed into the phone. Fix it before it snowballs. Layla froze in the doorway. What's going on? Riley snapped her head toward her, her expression a mixture of irritation and disdain. Stay out of it, Miss Brooks. This is a matter for Mr. Kareem. Layla crossed her arms. It's about me, isn't it? Before Riley could respond, Zaid entered the room, his movements brisk and deliberate. His usual composure seemed frayed, his jaw tight and his brow furrowed. He paused when he saw Layla, his gaze flicking to Riley. Leave us, he instructed, his tone sharp. Riley hesitated but complied, brushing past Layla with a look that was half warning, half pity. What's going on? Layla asked again, her voice firmer this time. Zaid exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. A story has leaked. About our arrangement. Her stomach dropped. What kind of story? He met her gaze, his expression grim. One that paints you as a gold digger who married me for my money. It also suggests this is not a real marriage. The words hit like a physical blow. Layla's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. And you think I leaked it? I didn't say that, Zaid replied, though there was a hesitation that made her blood boil. But the timing. You think I would do this? She interrupted, her voice rising. After everything. You think I'd sabotage myself just to humiliate you? Zaid's silence was deafening. Layla's breath came in short, sharp bursts, her anger mixing with hurt. Unbelievable, she muttered, turning away. This isn't about trust, Zaid said, stepping closer. This is about protecting both of us. The media will tear us apart if we don't handle this correctly. Layla spun around to face him. You're more worried about your image than whether I actually did this. Zaid's gaze hardened. You don't understand the stakes. This isn't just about me. It's about the company, the investors, the future. I don't care about your investors, she shouted, her voice cracking. You don't even care about the truth. You just care about damage control. The room fell into an icy silence. Zaid's face was a mask of control, but Layla could see the tension in his posture, the way his fists clenched at his sides. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but cold. Go to your room. I'll handle the press. Layla stared at him, her chest heaving with suppressed fury. Of course, that's what this marriage is, isn't it? You handle the press, and I disappear when things get messy. Without waiting for a response, she turned and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall until she was alone. Hours later, the fallout became clear. News outlets ran with headlines that twisted the narrative even further, portraying her as a manipulative opportunist who had trapped Zaid in a scandalous union. Images of her from the wedding surfaced, accompanied by speculative commentary that stung worse than any insult she'd ever received. By evening, Layla could no longer avoid the questions swirling in her mind. Who had leaked the story? Riley? Someone else in the mansion? Or had Zaid himself orchestrated it for reasons she couldn't yet fathom? The uncertainty gnawed at her, feeding her growing mistrust. She paced her room, the walls feeling like they were closing in. The photo of Zaid and the mysterious woman she'd seen earlier surfaced in her thoughts, a nagging reminder that she still knew so little about him. How could she fight a storm when she didn't even know the battlefield? Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. Miss Brooks, a smooth voice greeted her. You don't know me, but I know quite a lot about you, and I think we can help each other. Layla stared at her phone long after the call ended. The smooth voice of the stranger lingered in her mind, cryptic and unnerving. Who was he? And what did he mean by helping each other? She set the phone down, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and curiosity. Questions swirled in her mind, but one stood out above the rest. What wasn't Zaid telling her? Unable to sit still, she left her room, her footsteps soft against the carpeted halls of the mansion. The house felt eerily quiet, as if it too were holding its breath. She found herself wandering back to the room she'd discovered before, the one with the photo of Zaid and the mysterious woman. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been the first time. Layla hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls, the scent of aged wood and leather still hanging in the air. Her eyes were drawn once again to the photo on the table. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. The woman's face was beautiful, striking even, but it was her expression that caught Layla's attention, warm, trusting, and utterly unlike the Zaid she knew now. Her name was Amira, a voice said, breaking the silence. Layla nearly dropped the frame, spinning around to find Zaid standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was heavy with something she couldn't quite place. Regret? Anger? Pain? Layla set the photo down, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize, Zaid interrupted, stepping into the room. He moved with a certain deliberateness, as if each step carried the weight of the past. You are going to find out eventually. Find out what? Layla asked, her voice quiet but steady. Who she is, or who she was to you? Zaid sighed, his gaze falling to the photo. Amira was my fiancée. We were supposed to be married 3 years ago. Layla felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Jealousy? No, it was something deeper, more unsettling. What happened? She disappeared, Zaid said, his tone clipped. He walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. We were driving home from an event. There was an accident. I thought she'd died, but when I woke up in the hospital, she was gone. No body, no explanation. Layla's breath hitched. And you've been looking for her ever since? Yes, Zaid admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But she's more ghost than memory now. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them. Layla wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. She thought of the man she'd married, the carefully controlled exterior he presented to the world, and the cracks she was only now beginning to see. Is that why you married me? She asked finally. Because I'm nothing like her? Zaid turned to face her, his eyes sharp. I married you because it was necessary. This isn't about Amira. Layla scoffed, folding her arms. Of course it is. You don't trust me. You barely talk to me. And now I know why. You're still chasing a ghost. Enough, Zaid said sharply, his voice like a whip. This isn't about the past. Then what is it about? Layla shot back, her frustration boiling over. Because from where I'm standing, it feels like I'm just a placeholder. Zaid took a step closer, his expression darkening. You don't know anything about what I've lost. And whose fault is that? Layla countered, her voice cracking. You don't let anyone in, Zaid. Not me, not anyone. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps in the hall cut him off. Riley appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Mr. Kareem, she said, her voice tight. There's something you need to see. Zaid's jaw tightened, but he nodded, brushing past Layla without another word. Riley cast a fleeting glance at Layla before following him out, leaving her alone in the room once again. Layla sank into a chair, her legs trembling. Her eyes drifted back to the photo, to Amira's smiling face. A ghost, Zaid had called her. But ghosts didn't just haunt. They left shadows, remnants of what once was. And Layla couldn't shake the feeling that Amira's shadow was much closer than Zaid realized. The air in the mansion felt heavier after her confrontation with Zaid. Layla retreated to her room, her thoughts a tangled mess. Everything about this house, this arrangement, felt like it was suffocating her. She needed air, space to clear her mind. Without thinking, she grabbed a jacket and slipped out into the night. The garage loomed ahead, its modern facade stark against the dimly lit grounds. Layla hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The scent of oil and metal greeted her, familiar and oddly comforting. Rows of sleek cars lined the space, their polished exteriors gleaming under fluorescent lights. But it wasn't the cars that caught her attention. It was the workbench in the corner, cluttered with tools and parts. Her hands itched at the sight of the dismantled engine sitting atop the bench. She crossed the garage, her mind instinctively shifting gears. The bolts were loose, the components scattered haphazardly. Whoever had worked on it before clearly didn't know what they were doing. Layla picked up a wrench, the weight of it grounding her. For the first time in weeks, her mind felt quiet. She began to work, her movements precise and purposeful. The rhythmic clink of metal on metal filled the space. drowning out the chaos in her head. Minutes turned into hours as she lost herself in the task. By the time she stepped back, her hands were smudged with grease, but the engine purred softly. She smiled, a small, triumphant smile that she hadn't felt in far too long. "Impressive," a voice broke through the silence, making her jump. Layla spun around to find Zaid standing near the entrance, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice defensive. "I could ask you the same thing," Zaid replied, stepping closer. "This is my garage." Layla folded her arms, meeting his gaze. "Well, your engine was a mess. I figured I'd fix it before it gave up completely." Zaid raised an eyebrow, glancing at the now functional engine. "You did this yourself?" "Obviously," Layla shot back, her tone sharp. "What, did you think I was just playing around?" For a moment, Zaid said nothing. He approached the engine, inspecting her work. "You know," he began, his tone measured, "not many people could handle this model. It's unique." Layla shrugged, though her heart raced under his scrutiny. "I've seen worse." Zaid turned to face her, his expression softening slightly. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My dad," Layla said simply. "He taught me everything I know. Engines, wiring, diagnostics, you name it." There was a pause as Zaid studied her, his gaze thoughtful. "You're talented, Layla." The compliment caught her off guard, and she felt her cheeks warm. "It's just an engine," she muttered, brushing past him to wash her hands at the nearby sink. "It's not just an engine," Zaid countered, his voice firm. "Most mechanics wouldn't have been able to figure this out. And you did it in a few hours." Layla turned off the faucet, drying her hands with a towel. "What's your point?" "My point," Zaid said, stepping closer, "is that you're wasting your potential." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You could be doing so much more," he continued, undeterred. "This kind of skill, this kind of intuition, it's rare. You shouldn't be stuck in a rundown shop barely scraping by." Layla bristled at his words. "That shop is my family's legacy," she said, her voice sharp. "It may not be fancy, but it's ours." Zaid sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to insult you. I see potential in you, Layla, potential that's being wasted." "Maybe I don't want your opinion," she snapped, brushing past him. "And maybe you should stop pretending you care." Zaid didn't stop her as she walked out of the garage, her heart pounding. His words lingered, though, settling uncomfortably in her chest. For all her defiance, a small part of her couldn't shake the truth in what he'd said. The next morning, Layla's phone buzzed incessantly on her nightstand. Groaning, she reached for it, expecting another call from creditors or a reminder about her father's treatment. Instead, the screen was flooded with messages, texts, notifications, and missed calls from unknown numbers. Confused, she opened one of the links a sender had forwarded. Her blood ran cold. A photo of her seated across from Liam Carson stared back at her from the screen. The image, clearly taken without her knowledge, showed her leaning forward, appearing engaged in conversation. The caption was damning. "Zaid Karim's wife meets with his rival. Marriage or manipulation?" Her heart pounded as she scrolled through the article, the words blurring together. Claims of betrayal, manipulation, and speculation about her motives painted her as a gold digger orchestrating Zaid's downfall. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't just an attack. It was a full-scale character assassination. She barely had time to process before the door to her room swung open. Zaid stormed in, his phone clenched in one hand, his eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell is this, Layla?" he demanded, shoving the phone in her face. The same headline glared at her, the accusations bold and unrelenting. "I didn't," she began, but he cut her off. "You didn't what? You didn't meet with Liam because the evidence says otherwise." His voice was sharp, slicing through her attempts to respond. "I didn't leak this," she snapped, her anger bubbling to the surface. "I didn't even know someone was taking pictures." Zaid laughed bitterly, his disbelief palpable. "So what? You were just having a casual chat with the man who's been trying to destroy me for years? For what reason, Layla? What could you possibly have to discuss with him?" "I went to tell him to stay away from you," she shot back, her voice shaking. "To tell him to stop whatever game he's playing. I thought I was helping you." "Helping me?" Zaid's laugh was hollow, his gaze cold. You thought sneaking around behind my back with Liam Carson was helping me? You've done nothing but make this worse. Tears pricked at the corners of Layla's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I didn't ask for this, Zaid. I didn't ask for the press, the lies, or this godforsaken marriage. I'm doing the best I can. Your best isn't good enough, he said quietly, his tone cutting deeper than if he'd shouted. Silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Layla's chest heaved as she fought to steady her breathing. The sting of his words lodged in her throat, choking her. If you don't trust me, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, then what's the point of any of this? Zaid looked at her, his expression unreadable, before turning on his heel and walking out. The slam of the door echoed in her ears, leaving her standing alone, trembling with anger and hurt. Hours later, Layla found herself in the garage, the only place in the mansion where she felt even remotely grounded. She paced back and forth, replaying the argument in her mind. She knew Zaid had a right to be angry, but his refusal to even consider her side of the story burned like a fresh wound. Her hands itched for something to do, something to channel her frustration. She grabbed a wrench and began dismantling a nearby engine, the physical exertion a welcome distraction. But the knot in her chest refused to loosen. The sound of footsteps made her pause. She turned to see Zaid standing in the doorway, his expression softer but guarded. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice quiet. I shouldn't have reacted the way I did. Layla straightened, the wrench still in her hand. You think? Zaid exhaled, stepping closer. You were right. I don't trust easily. And with Liam involved, I jumped to conclusions. That's an understatement, she muttered, setting the wrench down. I don't expect you to forgive me, Zaid continued, his tone earnest. But I want to make this right. Tell me how. Layla crossed her arms, her gaze steady. Start by believing me. I didn't leak that story and I didn't betray you. Zaid nodded slowly. I believe you, and I'll deal with Liam. For the first time since the argument, Layla felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The ringtone pierced through the quiet of Layla's room, yanking her out of a restless sleep. She fumbled for the phone on her nightstand, squinting at the screen. The number was familiar, and dread coiled in her stomach. Answering quickly, she pressed the phone to her ear. Miss Brooks? The voice on the other end was calm but firm. This is Dr. Patel. Your father's condition has worsened. We've admitted him to the ICU. Layla's breath hitched, her heart pounding against her ribs. What happened? She asked, her voice shaking. He was fine during our last call. There's been a significant decline, Dr. Patel said gently. You should come as soon as you can. I'm on my way, she said, ending the call before he could respond. Throwing on the nearest jacket, she bolted out of her room, her mind racing. As she descended the grand staircase, she nearly collided with Zaid, who stood at the base, his phone in hand. Layla? He asked, frowning. What's going on? My dad, she managed, her voice trembling. He's in the ICU. I need to leave. Zaid's expression shifted from confusion to concern. I'll have the driver bring the car around. I don't have time to wait, she snapped, brushing past him. I'll take a cab. Layla, stop. His tone was firm, but there was no edge to it. I'll take you myself. She hesitated, torn between urgency and frustration, but ultimately nodded. Fine, just hurry. The ride to the hospital was tense, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Layla stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. She felt Zaid's gaze on her more than once, but he said nothing. She was grateful for it. She didn't trust herself to hold a conversation without breaking down. When they arrived, Layla all but ran through the hospital doors, Zaid trailing behind her. The sterile smell hit her like a wall, intensifying her panic. She found Dr. Patel near the nurse's station, his expression grim. Your father had a severe episode, he explained. His heart is under significant strain. Layla's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright. Can I see him? Dr. Patel nodded. He's stable for now, but we'll need to monitor him closely. She followed him into the room, her chest tightening at the sight of her father lying motionless against the stark white sheets. The man who had always seemed larger than life now looked small, frail. "Hey, Dad," she whispered, taking his hand. His eyelids fluttered open, and he gave her a weak smile. "Layla," he said, his voice barely audible, "you didn't have to come." "Of course I did," she replied, fighting back tears. "Don't be ridiculous." Zaid lingered in the doorway, his usual composure softened by the scene before him. He stepped forward cautiously, his presence quiet but steady. "Who's this?" her father asked, his gaze flickering to Zaid. "A friend," Layla said quickly, avoiding Zaid's glance. Her father chuckled weakly. "Fancy friend." Zaid offered a small smile. "Just here to make sure Layla's okay." Her father's eyes closed again, his breathing slow and labored. Layla felt her throat tighten, the weight of helplessness crushing her. She turned to Zaid, her voice a whisper. "I don't know what to do." Zaid hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing what you can," he said softly, "and that's enough." The words shouldn't have meant so much, but in that moment they did. Layla allowed herself a brief moment of solace before turning her focus back to her father. Hours passed in a blur of quiet conversations with doctors and nurses. Layla remained at her father's side, unwilling to leave even as exhaustion set in. Zaid stayed too, his presence unobtrusive but constant. By the time morning came, her father's condition had stabilized, but the underlying issues remained. Dr. Patel approached with a somber expression. "We'll need to discuss his long-term care," he said gently. "It won't be easy, Layla, but there are options." Layla nodded, her mind already spinning with the logistics. She felt Zaid step closer, his voice calm but resolute. "Whatever she needs, we'll make it happen." Layla glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to Zaid's intentions than she had given him credit for. Layla stepped into the kitchen, the morning light casting a muted glow through the large windows. She had barely slept after the long night at the hospital. Her father was stable, but the weight of his condition lingered heavily on her shoulders. The soft hum of a car pulling up outside broke her thoughts. It wasn't unusual for deliveries or visitors to arrive at the mansion, but something about the sound made her pause. The doorbell rang sharply, echoing through the house. Layla hesitated before moving to answer, her steps cautious. She opened the door, and her breath caught. Standing there was a woman, tall and striking, her features framed by sleek black hair. She was dressed simply, but there was an elegance about her that made Layla immediately self-conscious of her rumpled appearance. "Hello," the woman said, her voice calm but steady. "I'm here to see Zaid." Layla frowned, her guard immediately up. "And you are?" The woman's lips curved into a faint smile. "Amira." The name hit Layla like a slap, leaving her momentarily speechless. She had seen that face before, in the photo tucked away in Zaid's study. The ghost of Zaid's past stood before her, very much alive. Before Layla could respond, Zaid's voice came from behind her. "Amira?" Layla turned to see him standing at the base of the stairs, his usually stoic expression frozen in shock. He approached slowly, his gaze never leaving the woman at the door. "It's been a long time, Zaid," Amira said, her tone softer now. "May I come in?" Zaid nodded stiffly, stepping aside to let her in. Layla felt rooted to the spot, caught between the two of them. She didn't know whether to stay or leave, but the tension in the air was palpable. Amira's eyes flicked to Layla, curiosity evident in her gaze. "And you must be—" "Layla," Zaid said quickly, his voice firm. "My wife." The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. Amira's expression didn't change, but Layla thought she saw a flicker of something. Surprise? Disappointment? It was gone as quickly as it came. "I see," Amira said simply, turning back to Zaid. "We have a lot to talk about." Layla stepped back, feeling like an intruder in her own home. "I'll leave you two to it," she muttered, her voice tight. "No," Zaid said abruptly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You stay." Layla blinked, startled by the insistence in his voice. Amira arched an eyebrow but said nothing as she followed Zaid into the living room. Layla trailed behind, her heart pounding. Once seated, Amira spoke first. "I didn't mean to cause a scene by showing up unannounced, but I needed to see you." "You disappeared," Zaid said, his voice low but steady. I thought you were dead, Amira. I know, she replied, her gaze steady. And I'm sorry for the pain I caused, but there were circumstances beyond my control. What circumstances? Zaid asked sharply, the edge in his tone cutting through the room. Amira hesitated, her composure faltering for the first time. It's complicated, she said finally, but I'm here now because I need your help. Zaid's jaw tightened. You expect me to help you after everything? Yes, Amira said simply, because I know you, and I know you'll want the truth. The truth. The word reverberated through Layla's mind like a warning bell. She didn't know what was more unnerving, the fact that Amira had returned or the fact that Zaid's entire demeanor had shifted in her presence. He wasn't the controlled, calculating man Layla had come to know. He was someone else entirely, someone raw, conflicted, and vulnerable. What do you want? Zaid asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. To explain, Amira said, her gaze unwavering. But not here. Not now. She stood, smoothing the front of her dress. When you're ready to hear me out, call me. She placed a card on the table before turning to Layla. It was nice meeting you, Layla. I hope we'll get to talk more soon. With that, she left, the click of her heels fading into the distance. Layla stared at the card, a mixture of emotions churning within her. She looked at Zaid, who remained silent, his eyes fixed on the door. Are you okay? She asked cautiously. Zaid didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. I don't know. Layla felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by a growing sense of unease. Amira's return wasn't just a disruption, it was a storm waiting to break. Layla stood at the edge of the workshop Zaid had set up for her, staring at the chaos before her. Blueprints were strewn across the workbenches, parts of engines lay disassembled, and a faint smell of oil clung to the air. It was her haven now, the one place she felt in control amidst the swirling storm of emotions and unresolved questions that had consumed her life since Amira's return. She tightened the straps of her gloves and picked up a wrench. If Zaid wanted her to succeed with this project, she'd show him exactly what she was capable of. She'd channel all the confusion, the hurt, the doubt into the hum of machinery and the rhythm of her hands against the tools. This was her redemption too, not just his. The sound of footsteps made her pause. She turned to see Zaid standing in the doorway, his posture unusually hesitant. He wasn't the immovable figure she was used to. Something in his expression softened, as though he were searching for the right words. Layla, he began, stepping inside. Can we talk? About what? She asked, her tone clipped. She turned back to the engine she was working on, refusing to meet his gaze. About everything, Zaid said. About Amira. About us. Layla's hands stilled, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the wrench. What's there to talk about? You've made it pretty clear where I stand in all of this. That's not fair, Zaid said, his voice quiet but firm. You know it's more complicated than that. She spun around, her eyes blazing. No, Zaid, it's really not. You've been holding on to her for 3 years, and now she's back, and you can't even look me in the eye. Zaid flinched at her words, but he didn't back away. You're right, he admitted. I've been holding on to the past, but that's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me either. Layla blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. What are you saying? I'm saying, Zaid said, stepping closer, that I want to move forward, with you. She stared at him, searching his face for any trace of dishonesty. And Amira? Zaid exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. I don't have all the answers yet, but I know I can't keep living in her shadow, or making you live there. Layla felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Words are easy, Zaid, but actions speak louder. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, setting it on the workbench. This is the budget approval for your design. I've already greenlit the prototype. The team is ready to back you on this. Layla stared at the paper, her heart pounding. You're serious? Completely, Zaid said. You're brilliant, Layla, and the world deserves to see that. For a moment, Layla didn't know how to respond. She picked up the paper, running her fingers over the numbers and signatures. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a lifeline. proof that she wasn't just a placeholder in Zaid's life. "This doesn't change everything," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But it's a start," Zaid nodded. "That's all I'm asking for." The sound of a ringing phone shattered the moment. Zaid glanced at the screen and cursed under his breath. "It's the investors. I have to take this." Layla waved him off, her attention already drifting back to the engine. "Go, I've got work to do." As Zaid left, Layla allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. She wasn't naive. There were still challenges ahead, and the specter of Amira loomed large. But for now, she had something to fight for, and that was enough. Layla's hands trembled as she scanned the email again. Her inbox, usually filled with technical updates and correspondence from Zaid's engineering team, now displayed a message she couldn't ignore. Attached was a set of blueprints, her blueprints. The signature tweaks and unique modifications she had spent weeks perfecting were unmistakable. But the sender wasn't Zaid or anyone from his company. It was from a competitor. Her heart pounded as she sat back in her chair, her mind racing. How had they gotten this? Who had sent it? And more importantly, what were they planning to do with her work? Her stomach churned with a mix of anger and fear. She had poured everything into that design, and now it was in the hands of someone who had no right to it. "Layla," Zaid's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood at the doorway, his phone in hand. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "It's nothing," she lied, quickly closing the email. "Just work." Zaid frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Layla forced a smile, but it felt hollow. "I'm fine, really." Zaid studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "All right. But if there's something going on, you need to tell me." As he left, Layla exhaled shakily. She knew she couldn't keep this from him forever, but she needed time to figure out her next move. Whoever had stolen her design hadn't just violated her trust, they had challenged her integrity. And she wasn't going to let it go without a fight. Later that evening, Layla stayed late in the workshop, her mind focused on tracking the source of the leak. She pored over emails, project files, and security logs, searching for any sign of who might have accessed her work. Hours passed, and frustration mounted as she found nothing, until she stumbled upon a name in the system she didn't recognize. It was a contractor Zaid's company had recently hired, Ryan Keller. The name didn't mean much to her, but the activity log associated with it told her everything she needed to know. Ryan had accessed her blueprints days before they were completed, downloading them onto an external drive. Layla's hands clenched into fists. She had trusted this project to Zaid's team, and now someone had betrayed that trust. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Zaid's number. It rang twice before he answered. "Layla, what's going on?" "We have a problem," she said, her voice tight. "A big one." 20 minutes later, Zaid arrived at the workshop, his expression grim as she explained what she had found. He didn't interrupt, but the tension in his jaw was palpable. "Ryan Keller," he said finally, his tone cold. "I know the name. He was a short-term contractor, recommended by one of my senior engineers. I didn't think—" "You didn't think he'd steal from us?" Layla finished, her anger simmering. "Because he did, and now my design is out there." Zaid's gaze hardened. "I'll handle this." "Handle it how?" Layla demanded, stepping closer. "Because if this gets out, it won't just be my reputation on the line. It'll be yours too." Zaid met her eyes, his expression unwavering. "I said I'll handle it." Layla wanted to believe him, but doubt lingered. This wasn't just a professional setback, it was personal. Her work was more than just a project, it was a piece of herself, and she wasn't sure Zaid fully understood that. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the mansion grew increasingly tense. Zaid launched an internal investigation, his team working around the clock to track down Ryan Keller and recover the stolen blueprints. But as the days stretched into a week with no resolution, Layla's patience began to wear thin. One night, as she sat in the workshop reviewing her backup files, Zaid entered, his expression weary. "We found him," he said simply. Layla's heart leapt. And he's already sold the design," Zaid admitted, his voice heavy. "To Liam Carson. The name hit Layla like a punch to the gut. Of course it was Liam. He had been a thorn in Zaid's side for years, and now he had found the perfect way to strike at him. And at her. "This isn't over," Layla said, her voice firm despite the knot in her throat. "I'll make sure of it." Zaid nodded, his gaze steady. "We will." Layla tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The rain lashed against the windshield, each drop a reminder of the storm raging both outside and within her. She replayed the conversation with Zaid over and over in her mind. The revelation that Liam Carson now held her stolen design. The betrayal, the frustration, and the fear of losing everything gnawed at her. She needed air, space to think, but all she found was the storm. The headlights of an approaching car cut through the darkness, snapping her back to reality. She slowed her speed, her heart pounding. The narrow mountain road she had taken was unforgiving, winding sharply with little room for error. What had she been thinking, coming out here alone? The roar of an engine grew louder behind her. She glanced in the rearview mirror, frowning as the lights of another vehicle approached rapidly, too rapidly. The car swerved dangerously close, its headlights blinding her for a moment. Layla's pulse quickened as the vehicle bumped her rear fender, causing her car to lurch forward. "Are you kidding me?" she shouted, panic threading her voice. She tried to accelerate, but the car behind her matched her speed, its intentions clear. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheel, fighting to keep control. The cliffside loomed too close for comfort, the drop into darkness a constant threat. Another jolt sent her skidding, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. Her heart slammed against her chest as she wrestled the car back onto the road. The driver behind her wasn't backing off. If anything, they were getting bolder. A sudden turn appeared, sharper than she anticipated. Layla slammed on the brakes, the tires losing traction. The car spun, the world tilting as she careened toward the edge. A scream tore from her throat as the guardrail came into view. She braced herself for impact, but it never came. The car stopped inches from the edge, the back half teetering precariously. Layla sat frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound of the other car retreating into the distance left a ringing silence in its wake. Suddenly, another pair of headlights appeared, cutting through the rain. Layla flinched, her mind racing, but this time the car pulled up carefully. The driver's door opened, and Zaid emerged, his figure silhouetted against the beams of light. "Layla!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. He ran to her car, yanking the door open. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice trembled. "Just shaken." Zaid didn't hesitate. He unbuckled her seatbelt and helped her out, his hands steady against her trembling frame. He guided her away from the car, his arm firmly around her shoulders. Only when they were safely back by his car did he let go, turning to face her. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his tone a mixture of anger and fear. "You could have been killed." "I needed to get away," Layla snapped, tears streaming down her face. "I needed to clear my head." "In the middle of a storm? On a road like this?" Zaid's voice cracked, his emotions barely contained. "Do you have any idea what I would have done if I'd lost you?" Layla blinked, his words cutting through the haze of her panic. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Zaid began, his voice softer now, "that I can't lose you, Layla. Not now, not ever." Her breath caught as she stared at him, the raw vulnerability in his expression leaving her speechless. He took a step closer, his hand reaching for hers. "I've been a coward," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've kept you at arm's length because I was afraid. Afraid of losing someone else. Afraid of letting myself feel again. But you've changed everything." Tears welled in Layla's eyes, but this time they weren't born of fear or frustration. "Zaid," he cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to show you that you mean more to me than anything, that you're not just part of my life. You're the best part." Layla felt her walls crumbling, the weight of their shared struggles suddenly lighter. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. "Okay," she whispered, "but don't make promises you can't keep." "I won't," Zaid said, his voice steady. "Not this time." The soft knock on the door was barely audible over the rain pattering against the windows. Layla glanced up from the blueprints spread across the dining table, her mind still preoccupied with the chaos of the past few days. She had been working tirelessly to rebuild her design, determined to reclaim what had been stolen. The knock came again, firmer this time. Sighing, she pushed back her chair and went to the door. Standing there, soaked from the rain but unflinching, was Amira. "We need to talk," Amira said, her voice steady but devoid of its usual confidence. Layla hesitated before stepping aside to let her in. "Zaid's not here." "I know," Amira replied, brushing past her. She stood in the middle of the room, her arms crossed as she surveyed the space. "I came to see you." Layla's stomach tightened, but she closed the door and turned to face her. "What do you want?" Amira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, staring out at the rain. "You know," she began, her tone softer than Layla had ever heard it, "when I first came back, I thought everything would fall into place, that Zaid and I would pick up where we left off." Layla's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain silent. "I was wrong," Amira continued, turning to face her. "He's not the same man I left behind. And you've changed him." Layla frowned, crossing her arms. "What are you trying to say?" Amira stepped closer, her gaze steady but tinged with sadness. "I'm saying that I see now what I couldn't before. Zaid doesn't belong to me anymore. He belongs to you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Layla stared at her, unsure whether to believe her sincerity. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been clinging to something that doesn't exist," Amira admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought coming back would fix everything, but all I've done is make things harder for both of you." Layla felt a pang of sympathy, but she couldn't ignore the anger simmering beneath it. "You didn't just make things harder, Amira. You brought chaos into our lives. You made me question everything." "I know," Amira said quietly, "and I'm sorry for that, truly. But that's why I'm leaving." Layla blinked, stunned. "You're what?" "I'm leaving," Amira repeated, her tone resolute. "Zaid deserves to move on, and so do I. Staying here, trying to force something that's gone, it's not fair to anyone." For a moment, Layla didn't know what to say. She had spent so long feeling threatened by Amira's presence, so consumed by doubt and jealousy, that she hadn't considered what Amira might be going through. "Do you love him?" Layla asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Amira's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "I'll always love the man he was, but the man he is now? That's the man who loves you." Layla's breath hitched, her chest tightening with a mixture of relief and guilt. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Amira said, stepping back toward the door. "Just take care of him, and take care of yourself." She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "You're stronger than you think, Layla. Don't let anyone take that from you." With that, she opened the door and disappeared into the rain, leaving Layla standing there, her thoughts spinning. The room felt impossibly quiet in her absence, the storm outside a stark contrast to the calm settling over her heart. For the first time in weeks, Layla felt like she could see a way forward, not just for herself, but for her and Zaid. Amira's departure wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, the low hum of chatter filling the grand exhibition hall. Layla stood at the edge of the stage, her palms clammy and her heart pounding against her ribs. Her prototype, the culmination of weeks of grueling work, stood proudly on display under the bright lights. The sleek engine design had been polished to perfection, its compact frame showcasing the revolutionary efficiency she had worked tirelessly to achieve. "You ready for this?" Zaid's voice was calm, steady, as he stepped up beside her. He was dressed impeccably, but his demeanor was uncharacteristically relaxed. Layla glanced at him, her nerves barely hidden beneath a thin veneer of composure. "As ready as I'll ever be." He smiled faintly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've earned this, Layla. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Before she could respond, the announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, calling her name. The applause swelled as Layla took a deep breath and stepped forward, her legs feeling like lead beneath her. The sea of faces before her blurred together as she approached the podium, gripping its edges like a lifeline. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind in her chest. "It's an honor to stand here tonight and present something that started as a dream in my family's small garage." She paused, scanning the audience, her eyes landing briefly on Zaid. His steady gaze anchored her, giving her the courage to continue. "This design represents more than just innovation," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It represents resilience, determination, and the belief that even in the face of adversity, there's always a way forward." The applause that followed was deafening, washing over her like a wave. Layla stepped back, her chest heaving with a mix of relief and exhilaration. As she returned to her place beside Zaid, he leaned in, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You were incredible." Layla's lips twitched into a smile. "Thanks. I couldn't have done it without you." The ceremony continued, awards being handed out and speeches being made, but Layla barely heard any of it. Her mind was still reeling from the recognition she had just received. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not just as a mechanic or Zaid's wife, but as someone with a voice and a vision of her own. As the event wound down, people began to approach her, offering congratulations and questions about her design. Layla answered them as best she could, but the overwhelming attention left her feeling both exhilarated and drained. When the crowd finally thinned, Zaid appeared at her side, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "To your first of many triumphs," he said, handing her one. Layla chuckled softly, clinking her glass against his. "Let's hope the next one doesn't come with quite so much drama." "Where's the fun in that?" Zaid teased, his smile widening. Before she could respond, a man approached them, his sharp suit and confident demeanor instantly recognizable. Liam Carson. Layla's stomach twisted as he extended a hand, his smile polite but insincere. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kareem," Liam said smoothly. "Your design is impressive." Layla took a breath, steeling herself. "Thank you," she said evenly, "though I'm sure you already knew that." Liam's smile faltered briefly, but he recovered quickly. "Let's just say it's rare to see such talent from unexpected places." Zaid stepped in then, his voice low and measured. "And it's even rarer to see stolen designs amount to nothing." Liam's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing further. With a tight smile, he excused himself, disappearing back into the crowd. Layla exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "You handled that well," Zaid said, his tone approving. "Thanks," Layla replied, still watching Liam's retreating figure. "But this isn't over. He's not going to give up that easily." "Neither will we," Zaid said, his voice firm. "Tonight is yours, Layla. Let's make sure it's just the beginning." As the applause echoed one last time, Layla felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. The tension in the room was palpable as Zaid and Layla sat across from their legal team. The sleek, glass-walled office was a far cry from the chaos that had led them here, but it did little to soothe the fire burning inside Layla. She tapped her pen against the table, her frustration barely contained. "Our investigators traced the transaction," one of the lawyers said, adjusting his glasses. "It confirms what we suspected. Liam Carson purchased the stolen design through an intermediary. He's been distributing it to potential investors as his own." Layla clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. "He didn't even bother to modify it," she said through gritted teeth. "He's selling my work as if I don't exist." Zaid's expression darkened, his jaw tight. "And the investors, are they aware the design is stolen?" "Not yet," the lawyer replied. "But if we act quickly, we can issue a cease and desist and notify the relevant parties." Layla shook her head. "That's not enough. Liam needs to face real consequences for this. He can't keep doing this to people." Zaid placed a hand over hers, his touch grounding her. "We'll make sure he does," he said, his voice firm. "But we need to be strategic. If we go public too soon, it could damage the reputation of your design." "I don't care about my reputation," Layla shot back, her voice cracking. "I care about justice." Zaid held her gaze, his eyes steady. "You'll have both." As the meeting adjourned, Layla stepped out into the hallway, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her. Zaid followed, his presence a quiet reassurance. "Hey," he said softly, We'll get through this. Layla sighed, leaning against the wall. It's not just about the design, Zaid. It's about everything. He's trying to take away everything I've worked for, everything I am. And he won't succeed, Zaid said, his voice resolute. You're stronger than he is, Layla. And you have something he doesn't, integrity. Layla managed a small smile, but the fire in her eyes remained. Let's prove it then. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Layla worked tirelessly with Zaid and their team, gathering evidence and reaching out to investors. Each step felt like a battle, but with every piece of proof they uncovered, the tide began to turn. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. A high-profile investor meeting had been scheduled, and Liam was set to present his groundbreaking design. Layla and Zaid were there, armed with their evidence and ready to confront him. The meeting room buzzed with energy as investors mingled, their excitement palpable. Liam stood at the front, his confidence radiating as he prepared to unveil the stolen design. Layla's stomach churned, but she kept her composure. This was her moment. As Liam began his presentation, Zaid stood, his presence commanding the room. "Excuse me, Mr. Carson," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Before you continue, I believe there's something the investors should see." Liam faltered, his confident facade cracking. "What are you talking about?" Zaid motioned to Layla, who stepped forward with a tablet in hand. She activated the screen, projecting the original blueprints onto the room's large display. "This is the design you're about to present," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "But it's not yours, it's mine." Gasps rippled through the room as Layla detailed the modifications and unique features that proved her ownership. Liam's face turned pale, his composure unraveling with each word. "Furthermore," Zaid added, stepping beside Layla, "we have documentation tracing the theft back to your intermediary. You've not only stolen from Layla, but deceived these investors as well." The room erupted into murmurs, investors exchanging looks of shock and anger. Liam attempted to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the backlash. "I trusted you," one investor shouted. "You lied to all of us." Security arrived moments later, escorting Liam from the room as he sputtered weak denials. Layla watched him go, her chest heaving with a mixture of relief and vindication. For the first time, she felt the weight of his betrayal lift. As the meeting concluded, investors approached Layla, offering their support and interest in her design. Zaid placed a hand on her back, his touch a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We did it," Layla corrected, a genuine smile breaking across her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The room was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines monitoring Layla's father. She sat by his bedside, her hand clasping his, willing him to wake up. The surgery had been a success, but the recovery was uncertain. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "The next 24 hours are critical." Zaid entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by the soft hospital carpet. He placed a cup of coffee on the table beside her and took a seat. His presence was steady, grounding, but Layla couldn't bring herself to look at him. "Layla," he said softly, "you've been here for hours. You need to rest." "I can't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What if he wakes up and I'm not here?" Zaid leaned forward, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "He'll understand. You've been here every step of the way." She shook her head, her grip on her father's hand tightening. "I can't lose him, Zaid. He's all I have left of my family." "You're not going to lose him," Zaid said firmly. "And you're not alone. I'm here." Layla looked at him then, her eyes red and tired. "Why? Why are you still here, Zaid? You don't owe me anything." Zaid's expression softened, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here because I care about you, Layla. Not because I owe you. Not because of any arrangement. Because I want to be." Before Layla could respond, her phone buzzed on the table, the sudden sound cutting through the stillness. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It was an unknown number. Reluctantly, she answered. "Miss Brooks," a cold, familiar voice greeted her. "Liam Carson." "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp. Liam chuckled darkly. "You thought you'd seen the last of me, didn't you? Well, I have a little surprise for you." Layla's stomach twisted as Liam continued. "I have something you value, your original prototype. And if you want it back, you'll meet me. Alone. Zaid leaned closer, catching the fear in her expression. What is it? He asked, his tone urgent. It's Liam, she said, her voice trembling. He has my design. Zaid's jaw tightened. You're not meeting him alone. I don't have a choice, Layla shot back. If I don't go, he'll destroy everything. Zaid stood, his presence towering. Then we go together. The abandoned warehouse Liam had chosen as the meeting place was as ominous as it was cliché. The air was thick with dampness, the faint smell of rust and decay clinging to the shadows. Layla stepped inside, her heart pounding, Zaid close behind her. Liam, she called out, her voice echoing. I'm here, where's my design? Liam stepped out from the shadows, holding a USB drive aloft. Right here, he said smugly. But I don't give without getting something in return. What do you want? Layla demanded. Liam smirked. Simple. Zaid signs over his majority stake in his company. Or this, he waved the USB, disappears forever. Zaid's expression hardened, his stance unyielding. That's not going to happen. Then you leave me no choice, Liam said, pulling a lighter from his pocket. He held it dangerously close to the USB drive. One flick, and it's gone. Before Layla could react, Zaid stepped forward, his movements swift and deliberate. In a blur, he knocked the lighter from Liam's hand, the clatter echoing through the warehouse. A struggle ensued, the two men grappling as Layla watched in horror. Stop! She screamed, her voice breaking. Zaid, stop! But the fight escalated, and in the chaos, a beam above them cracked, weakened by years of neglect. Layla's eyes widened as she saw it begin to fall. Zaid, look out! She shouted, running toward him. Zaid barely had time to react. He pushed her out of the way just as the beam came crashing down, pinning him to the ground. Layla fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to free him. Zaid, she sobbed, stay with me, please. I'm fine, he said, his voice strained. It's just my leg. Liam stood frozen, the USB drive still in his hand. For the first time, Layla saw fear in his eyes. Call for help, she snarled at him. Now. Liam hesitated before dropping the drive and bolting. Layla didn't care. She focused on Zaid, her tears falling freely. You idiot, she said through her sobs. Why did you do that? Because you're worth it, Zaid replied, his voice barely a whisper. You're worth everything. Layla sat at Zaid's bedside, her fingers brushing gently against his. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the monitors that kept track of his condition. His leg was in a cast, his face pale but peaceful as he slept. The chaos of the warehouse, the falling beam, Liam's escape, it all felt like a bad dream. But the weight of Zaid's sacrifice was very real. The door creaked open and Layla looked up to see a nurse entering with a clipboard. He's stable, the nurse said kindly, offering a reassuring smile. You can rest easy now. Layla nodded, though rest felt impossible. As the nurse left, she turned back to Zaid, her eyes lingering on his face. She hadn't realized how deeply he had carved himself into her life until the moment she almost lost him. Zaid stirred, his eyes fluttering open. His gaze landed on her, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. Hey, he said, his voice hoarse. Hey yourself, Layla replied, her voice catching. You scared the hell out of me. Sorry, he murmured, his smile fading as he shifted uncomfortably. Guess I'm not great at avoiding falling beams. She huffed a laugh, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. You shouldn't have pushed me out of the way. And let you get hurt, Zaid said, his tone soft but firm. Not a chance. Layla looked down, her fingers tightening around his. You always put everyone else first, Zaid. But who's looking out for you? I don't need anyone to, he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. I'm fine as long as you're okay. Her breath hitched, and for a moment the words she wanted to say felt too big, too heavy, but she couldn't hold them back any longer. I'm not okay, Zaid. Not when I thought I was going to lose you, not when I realized how much you mean to me. His brow furrowed, and he reached up to cup her face, his touch gentle. Layla, no, let me finish, she interrupted, her voice trembling. This whole thing started as an arrangement, a deal, but it's not that anymore, not for me. Zaid's thumb brushed against her cheek, wiping away a tear. It hasn't been just a deal for me either, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Not for a long time. The words hung between them, unspoken truths finally brought into the light. Layla leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I'm scared," she whispered, "of how much I feel for you, of what it means." "So am I," Zaid said softly, "but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." Her lips quirked into a small, watery smile. "You're such a sap." "And you love it?" he teased, his smile widening. Layla laughed, the sound light and free, breaking the tension that had held her captive for so long. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady now. "I think I do." Zaid's smile softened, and he pulled her closer, their foreheads still touching. "Good," he murmured, "because I know I love you." The words hit her like a warm rush of light, filling the empty spaces she hadn't even realized were there. She closed the gap between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that spoke of everything they couldn't put into words. It was tentative but real, fragile yet unbreakable. When they finally pulled apart, Layla rested her head on the edge of his bed, her hands still clasping his. "You're stuck with me now, you know." Zaid chuckled, the sound deep and comforting. "I wouldn't have it any other way." For the first time, Layla felt like the future wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. Together, they could face whatever came next. Because together, they were stronger. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the new workshop, casting a warm glow over the sleek machines and tools arranged with meticulous care. Layla adjusted the fit of her gloves, a grin tugging at her lips as she surveyed the space. It wasn't just a workspace. It was a sanctuary, built from resilience, trust, and an unyielding partnership. "Ready to give the investors a show?" Zaid's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He leaned against the doorway, his suit perfectly tailored, but his expression uncharacteristically relaxed. Layla smirked, her confidence shining through. "Always." The new facility was the culmination of their combined efforts. What had started as a stolen design had evolved into a revolutionary project, refined and strengthened by months of collaboration. Investors from around the world were gathered today, eager to see the future of the industry. As the clock struck 10, Layla joined Zaid in the presentation room, where rows of chairs were filled with curious faces. She glanced at Zaid, who gave her a reassuring nod before stepping up to the podium. "Good morning," Zaid began, his voice calm and commanding. "Today we're not just unveiling a product. We're showcasing the result of innovation, determination, and a shared vision." He motioned for Layla to join him, stepping aside as she took the lead. "This design isn't just about efficiency," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about rewriting what's possible. It's about challenging the limits we've placed on ourselves and proving that progress isn't just a goal. It's a responsibility." The applause that followed was thunderous, the energy in the room electric. Layla stepped back, exchanging a glance with Zaid that spoke volumes. This was their moment. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of conversations, demonstrations, and commitments from investors who were not only impressed, but eager to be part of the journey. Layla's heart swelled with pride as she saw the excitement her work had sparked, the validation of her vision finally within reach. As the last investor departed, Layla and Zaid retreated to the office overlooking the facility. She sank into the plush chair, kicking off her shoes with a sigh of relief. "You were amazing today," Zaid said, sitting across from her. "They couldn't stop talking about your presentation." Layla chuckled, leaning back. "You weren't so bad yourself. Maybe we make a good team after all." "Maybe?" Zaid teased, his brow raising. "I think we've proven that." Her smile softened, and she met his gaze. "We have, haven't we?" Zaid leaned forward, his tone turning serious. "Layla, everything we've built, it's not just about the business. It's about us, what we've become together." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I know, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." The warmth in his eyes was undeniable, and for a moment the world outside the room seemed to fade. They weren't just partners in business, they were partners in every sense of the word. Their bond forged through fire and tested by challenges that would have broken others. "Here's to us," Layla said, lifting an imaginary glass. "To us," Zaid echoed, a grin spreading across his face. As the sun set over the horizon, casting the workshop in hues of gold and amber, they sat together, basking in the glow of their shared success. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together.